Welcome back to the Aggression in Dogs Conference for our keynote presentation from none other than Dr. Kathy Murphy. I wanted to take a final moment to thank all of our sponsors, including our premier sponsor, Fenzi Dog Sports Academy, as well as APDT, Blue Nine, CCPDT, Dogwise, Karen Pryor Academy, Milena DiMartini, Paula Nowak, Wolf Culture, the Loose Leash Academy, and AggressiveDog.com. Special thanks to all of our incredible speakers for sharing their insight and knowledge. As always, I have learned so much from all of them. And of course, Joanna and I want to thank all of you for coming to the conference and all the amazing work you're doing to help dogs with aggression. We hope to see you at next year's conference, happening from October 22nd to 24th, which we hope to be a hybrid event with an in-person and online option in Chicago, Illinois. And now on to our keynote speaker, Dr. Kathy Murphy, who's a veterinarian, neuroscientist, and dog behavior enthusiast who focuses her career on working to improve and support animal welfare and ethical practice. She gained her veterinary degree in 1999 from the Royal Veterinary College, 2 further postgraduate qualifications from the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, and her PhD in behavioral neuroscience from the Department of Experimental Psychology, University, Oxford, United Kingdom. After realizing that to really understand the clinical questions she faced, she needed to understand how the brain worked. She has worked in clinical practice and research institutions in the United Kingdom and the USA, is the founder of Barking Brains, an outreach project making neuroscience accessible for the training and behavior community. She is a founding member of Ethics First, a collective raising the awareness of developing ethical issues in modern day veterinary practice, sits on several internationally advisory groups and boards, and is a past trustee and veterinary advisor for the Rottweiler Welfare Association. She is currently the director of the Comparative Biology Center in the UK, where one of her research interests is the impact of animal handling methods on stress and well-being. She presents and lectures internationally to academics, clinicians, and non-scientists. She believes passionately that science can be communicated without jargon, and she has 3 amazing dogs of her own and doesn't get much time for sleep. I met Kathy a few years ago and had a truly enlightening discussion with her about neuroscience, and just knew she would be the perfect way to top off the conference and bring the neuroscience lens to aggression in dogs. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Kathy Murphy.
Hi, I'm Kathy Murphy. I'm really excited to be here with you for the Aggression in Dogs Conference 2020. Wow, what a year it's been. So before we begin, I'll just let you know a little bit about myself. I'm a veterinary surgeon. I qualified from the Royal Veterinary College in London, UK in 1999. I'm also a neuroscientist, having completed a PhD in behavioural neuroscience at the University of Oxford, UK, and having since worked as assistant professor at the Icahn School of Medicine, New York. I'm now back in the UK working on the director of the Comparative Biology Centre. And essentially, I fuse all of my career interests into a career that focuses on understanding the brain and behaviour in vulnerable populations. So I spend a lot of my time working with the laboratory animal community and looking at ways to reduce suffering of laboratory animals through understanding the brain and behaviour. I also have a clinical interest in anaesthesia and pain processing, and those two are not entirely separate. Anaesthesia and pain processing is very much, in order to be a good clinician, you need to understand how the brain works, and it's ultimately all about consciousness and behaviour and pain processing and how pain processing impacts on behaviour. So it sounds like I've got a lot of kind of separate interests, but actually I've been lucky enough to be able to merge them all into a career path where I can explore all of those different areas. I'm also director of Barking Brains, which is a new venture bringing my neuroscience perspective to the animal training and behaviour community. So it's currently just me and my 4 dogs, but we've got big plans for the future. So hopefully you'll see more of us in that guise. Okay, so the neuroscience of aggression. Let us begin. It's a huge topic, and actually for today, we're obviously not going to be able to cover the entirety of that topic. If we imagine that all of the neuroscience of aggression knowledge in the world was within this circle, then today we're going to cover just that amount of it. Can't see it? I'll magnify it. There you go. It's still a tiny amount. In truth, the title is so broad because when Mike first asked me to do this talk last year, we had a really interesting conversation around what is aggression. And when we're thinking about the neurobiology of aggression, it's the first place I began when I was preparing for this talk, was thinking about what it is about canine aggression that is either similar or different to aggression in other species, and where the similarities and differences are in neurobiology. Now, because the subject matter is so vast, we're going to kind of focus it down on 3 learning objectives for today. So those are that by the end of this lecture, you'll be able to list 3 important brain regions that are involved in aggression, describe 2 ways that brain function is disturbed in aggressive animals, and identify 3 ways to influence brain pathways in aggression cases. And that last learning objective is really the bit that you can take away and hopefully then start to think about how you might apply this knowledge to your aggression cases in practical terms. So what is aggression? Well, certainly if you ask the average member of the public what aggression is, the conversation very quickly comes round to bite statistics. And the CDC data is probably the largest robust data set. It's about 20 years old now, so it's quite old. But they looked at various factors involved in dog bites and showed that about 370,000 bites needed treatment in the USA every year. So that's dog bites needing treatment every year. And that there was a higher risk propensity if you were male and higher risk if you were young, so between 0 and about 7 years old. Now, what they also estimated was that was a very small proportion of total bites, with 80 to 93%, depending on which data set you look at, of dog bites that don't require treatment. So the actual figures for dog bites in the United States are quite staggering. So you can understand why it's a public health issue or a focus for the CDC to look at. Now, how does that compare to other countries? Well, a couple of years ago, we had a nice study conducted by Westgarth et al. Looking at overall lifetime incidents in a population, and they found that 19 per 1,000 people had been bitten by a dog throughout their lifetime. And these data do compare to the US data. They're obviously looking at slightly different angles. So the US data are looking at bites per year, and the UK data are looking at whether a person in the population has been bitten throughout their entire life. But you can see that the figures are surprisingly similar, or of a similar magnitude, order of magnitude. Now, in the UK study, 33% required treatment, so that's higher than in the CDC data, with 0.6% requiring hospital admission. But really, bite statistics, I mean, I'm preaching to the converted now, but we all know that bite statistics don't actually tell you anything about aggression per se. they're not giving us any information about the neurobiology of aggression or of the situations where aggression may be displayed. If you're interested in exploring the epidemiology of dog bites further, there's a really nice paper by Polo 2015 in Memorandum of Rudy Demeester, and that goes into a lot more detail about the epidemiology. But for now, I'm going to leave the bite statistics and move on to looking at how we can actually start to probe what's going on in terms of dog aggression. So if we look at aggression testing and what information we can get from that, we see that there are certainly breed and source differences, and those effects are reproducible across a number of different testing platforms and in a number of different demographics, so different countries and different demographics of dogs. These data are taken from Schwartberg 2006. So this is a large data set, 13,000 dogs with 31 breeds. And these data are divided up into 4 categories, so herding, working, terriers and gun dogs. And you can see there that the data are stratified according to those, with trait scores for 4 categories: playfulness, curiosity, sociability and aggressiveness. So this study was a temperament test study, so not specifically looking at aggressiveness, but aggressiveness was one of the traits that they looked at. But the difficulty with these data is that about 20% of dogs will pass a temperament test, even though they have a bite history. So aggressiveness in this temperament test actually wasn't a trait that was very well correlated with bite history. So it doesn't necessarily predict very well whether a dog is likely to or not likely to bite when it's in a real world situation. We have to remember that testing is quite an artificial setup, an artificial situation, and so it's quite different to real life situation. Other studies that have shown this poor predictability between temperament assessments and aggression displayed in real life situations. There are a couple of studies that looked at food related aggression in the shelter and showed that it was poorly predicting food related aggression in the home. So again, we've got this disparity between temperament testing in one environment and then the incidence or likelihood of display of aggressive behaviour in real world situations. Now, questionnaires aim to tackle this by looking at, this would be where owners, for instance, would receive a detailed questionnaire that they would fill out about their dog's behaviour in lots of different situations. So that's a way of being able to probe these questions and look specifically at a dog's behaviour within real life situations. And these data are from Duffy et al. Sorry, I'll take that back out. So Duffy et al. In 2008, so that's the UPenn group, used the CBART questionnaire, and their study looked at 6,000 dogs of 30 breeds and found that 20% had stranger aggression and 30% had unfamiliar dog aggression. Now, there were breed and strain differences, but again, they found that there were contextual differences. And if we have a look, these data are taken from that paper. So we're looking on the left-hand side at a graph of stranger-directed aggression on the y-axis, so that's the vertical axis, plotted against stranger-directed fear on the x-axis, so that's the horizontal axis. And then the graph next to that on the right-hand side is a similar graph, but looking at dog-directed aggression as opposed to stranger-directed aggression and dog-directed fear as opposed to stranger-directed fear. And that does say fear just there. Where is it? Oh, hang on, there. I did get that right. Dog-directed fear. It says FE, but that's because I'm covering up the AR. So these data shown in this particular figure are stratified according to dog breed, and we can see some standout performers. So we can see that Dachshunds score very highly for both fear and aggression, and that Labradors score much lower for both aggression and fear. So there we can see breed differences. There's clearly a genetic component to the expression of aggression in those two breeds. using those two breeds as an example. But that's not the whole story, because you can see that there isn't a linear relationship between fear and aggression in all dog breeds. Otherwise, they would all be lining up in a line between Labradors and Dachshunds. So if we have a look at Siberian Huskies, for instance, we see that Siberian Huskies do score low for stranger-directed fear and dog-directed fear, but there's a difference in their expression of stranger-directed aggression and dog-directed aggression, with Huskies showing a greater propensity for dog-directed aggression. And if we look at the English Springer Spaniel, we see the same thing. So again, very similar in terms of stranger-directed fear and dog-directed fear, but a difference in terms of stranger-directed aggression and dog-directed aggression. So now we start to see these differences in terms of the context or the target of the aggression. Now, we can also look at studies that examine these questions via surveys. So this is a very similar scientific approach to the questionnaire approach. And Casey in 2013 used a survey looking at 4,000 dogs, and again found breed differences. So again showing that there's some genetic component underlying the expression of aggression, and also contextual differences, so showing that there's an strong environmental influence on the expression of aggression. Now, in their survey, they showed that the risk of aggression increased with age, and they talked about that being potentially linked with learning, that the dogs had learned how to respond to certain situations in an aggressive manner, and so therefore with increased age were more likely to show aggression. They did touch on pain as being a possible factor influencing this increased risk. I probably, having looked at the data, I would suggest that there's nothing in the data that would lead me to think that pain shouldn't be the prioritised as a possible cause for this increased aggression with age. And we'll come on later to talk about how pain changes brain processing and becomes a major factor in the expression of aggressive behaviour, as well as changing lots of other behaviours also. But I really think that this increased risk of aggression with age is probably likely down to undiagnosed painful conditions, or indeed diagnosed painful conditions, but a lot of the time undiagnosed painful conditions. They also showed a 2.4-fold increase in rescues, and that's not wholly surprising, as many dogs are given up for rescue because of a bite history or because of behavioural problems that may lead them to express aggression. So yeah, not entirely surprising. Now, the difficulty with surveys and with questionnaires is that it's difficult to limit bias. And if we take the Rottweiler as an example, which is a breed close to my heart, from my years working with the Rottweiler Welfare Association, we see that in the CBARC study, Rottweilers scored high. They scored low for stranger-directed fear and low for dog-directed fear. And they scored high for both stranger-directed aggression and dog-directed aggression. But actually, my experience of that breed is that a lot of their aggression is frequently associated with fear. But Rottweilers are not the most expressive of animals, and they very rarely show overt behavioural signs, so facial expressions, body posture expressions of fear. And if they do, they're often for a very short period of time before the action comes. So it's actually very easy for owners to miss that, and it's usually just through video footage of seeing how the dog's responding and then going back through it with the owner to be able to educate them on what to look for, that they can actually see that it might be associated with fear. But To the untrained eye, it can very often look like it's not associated with fear at all, and so that bias will be reflected when people are filling out questionnaires and surveys. So we need to bear in mind that there will be some breed bias. Some breed bias that is there, and then also some other bias, which is just a function of things like not showing overt signs, behavioural signs of fear. Now, we certainly know that aggression is a problem that the public certainly want us to help them deal with, pet owners want us to help them deal with. And it isn't just the dogs that we're helping. We need to remember that dog aggression has a huge impact on the caregivers too. And I wanted to highlight this paper by Buller and Ballantyne 2020. I'm not going to suggest many neuroscience papers for you guys to read because the neuroscience literature is extremely unpenetrable. But there are some papers that I'll point out to you that are much more accessible, and this is one of them. I really like this paper by Buller and Ballantyne. Caregiver burden is an area that I'm particularly interested in from a kind of from the perspective of the human animal interaction and the dynamics of human animal psychology, but also because I suffer with caregiver burden. So every time I rescue a dog, I feel the impact of caregiver burden, partly because I don't make life easy for myself. So I always end up with dogs that have various behavioural problems. And there's an emotional roller coaster that goes along with that. And I think we need to remember that we're not just going in to support the dog with dog aggression, we're very much going in to support the owner with how they manage the dog, but actually with how they manage their own emotional roller coaster as well. And in this paper, Buller and Ballantyne looked at 4 categories: so caretaking, emotions, coping strategies, and the support that people felt were available to them. And certainly they reflected on the fact that aggression cases and behavioural cases are associated with reduced quality of life and acute and chronic stress. And obviously they can sometimes lead to euthanasia, which will increase the acute and chronic stress for the owners and has a devastating impact on the animal because it's irreversible, clearly. One of the quotes that's taken from this paper is, "People may not understand the stress, the money involved, and the restrictions." And I think it's worth remembering that our owners, when we talk to people that are dealing with an aggressive dog, they often have a lot of other considerations that are going on, both in terms of family dynamics because of these factors that are involved, and all obviously very emotive because of the situation. So, behavioural cases, but particularly aggression cases, are complex and they need a multidisciplinary approach. And there's a really nice opinion piece by DeCuster and Overall 2011. It's an opinion piece, it's not a research article, but it just talks through why it's so important for aggression cases that we have a multidisciplinary approach to them. So not just thinking about how to prevent the behaviour, but also thinking about all of the other factors that go with that. So making sure we're addressing the underlying drivers for that behaviour for the dog, but also how we set the owner up for success and support the owner with how to manage that situation. So let's get back to this question: what is aggression? Types of aggression. Well, when we're thinking about how to describe aggression, we can think about target context. So dog-to-dog aggression or stranger aggression, or situational. So there may be certain situations where the aggressive behaviour is displayed. We can also think about a motivational context. State-dependent aggression is something that I've had to deal with very recently. I've recently got a Belgian Shepherd, a Malinois Raven, who's actually pictured above me here. This is her when she was working as a police dog. And she retired about 2 months ago now. And she's now living with me. So that's the first time she's had to live in a house and navigate all the complexities of living with a human, but also living with 3 other dogs. And she has she displays aggressive behaviour when her brain is in particular states. Now, it took me a while to actually work out that it was state-dependent aggression, because at first I was looking at all the usual factors that you might examine when you're working with an aggressive dog. So looking at, was it directed towards one particular target? So was it directed towards one particular dog in the house? It was mostly directed towards Nancy, my Rottweiler, but not always. So it wasn't target specific. Then looking at whether factors like resource guarding were driving that behaviour. And yes, there were resources being guarded in some of the incidents, but not all of them. So again, it wasn't resource specific. Was it fear related? Well, it didn't seem to be related to fear behaviours or situations where one might expect that fear would be the underlying emotion. And actually what I started to do was look at what the triggers were for the aggressive behaviour. So there were certain triggers like toys, food, the presence of Nancy, etc., etc. And then looking at presenting those triggers, not Nancy, I didn't present Nancy to Raven, that would be wholly unethical, but looking at presenting those triggers when her brain was in different states. And I'm not suggesting that you guys do this, because this is not for the faint-hearted. But we don't have time to go through exactly how I set this up, but I set this up with a systematic approach that it included safety measures, so that I could present those triggers when her brain was in different states. And actually it then became crystal clear that her aggressive behaviour is only displayed when her brain is in an aroused, frustrated state. Now those two are clearly very linked, arousal and frustration. Frustration always being associated with a high level of arousal, but a high level of arousal not always being associated with frustration. And for Raven, her aggressive behaviour is displayed when her brain is in an aroused, frustrated state. Now that was important for me to be able to diagnose, because that enabled me to be able to manage it so that I could reduce the opportunities for her to practice that behaviour, and actually pretty well eliminate it from the various situations where I was seeing it. Now, the one thing I haven't mentioned here is pain, and anyone who's following Barking Brains will soon see when I'm due to start posting. I've been a little bit quiet on Barking Brains because we've had the global pandemic, which has just turned my life upside down, and I've been very busy at work, but I'm going to start posting again and start with a series about Raven. And so you'll see that pain is still very much something that I'm in the process of diagnosing, and I do think it plays into the expression of her aggressive behaviour, but also an expression of lots of other behaviours that she shows. And she was retired from the police early because of a behavioural issue, and I think that pain may be underlying that. So yeah, if you're interested in that, join me on the Barking Brains page, where I'll go into more detail about the neurobiological link between pain and the behaviour that she was showing. So these types of aggression are categorical. So when we describe aggression in this way, we're using categorical types to describe it. Now, there's another way that we can describe aggression, and that's as reactive or proactive. So reactive aggression would be emotional, associated with increased arousal, and it's kind of what we think of as heat of the moment aggression. Whereas proactive would be described as unemotional, not that there's really such a thing as unemotional, but unemotional, associated with low arousal and cold-blooded, so that kind of planned aggression, if you like. And when we use these descriptions, we're using the description type is dimensional. Now, neither categorical nor dimensional on their own really describe canine aggression. So for canine aggression, how about we try adding categorical and dimensional together? So if we say use categorical descriptions, we're talking about dog-to-dog aggression, and the motivational context may be fear, so dog-to-dog fear aggression. And the dimensional category would be reactive, for instance. So we'd have a dog that has reactive aggression. It's the emotional driver is fear, and it's directed to other dogs. So that would be an example of describing an aggressive case using a combination of categorical and dimensional descriptions. So, does that solve the problem? Ta-da! Well, not quite. Let's go back to thinking about what aggression actually is. So, aggression is a violent act with the intention to do harm. That's the definition of aggression. How many of our dogs actually intend to do harm? Well, I'm not convinced that very many of them do intend to do harm. And I think a vast majority of the cases that we see of dog aggression may all be a spectrum of normal responses without the intention to do harm. And that sets them apart a little bit from a large part of the human aggression drivers and the way that we think about types of human aggression. So what we have to remember when we're discussing canine aggression is that we're describing a behaviour and not a condition. So very often, when people come and they say, I need some help with a dog aggression case, what they mean is I need some help with a dog bite case. That might not be quite the same as the aggression underlying that bite per se. We're describing the behavioural output, but not necessarily the neurobiology, emotional drivers, etc. Beneath that. So dog aggression is phenomenologically heterogeneic, and it takes quite a bit of time to learn to say those. I'm not suggesting that you need to be able to pronounce those. But essentially what that means is that it involves lots of different motivations and triggers. Excuse me, I'll just have a little sip of my cup of tea. But all is not lost when we're trying to relate this to the neurobiology of canine aggression. And if we go back to reactive and proactive aggression, there's a very clear delineation in terms of neurobiology between reactive and proactive aggression. And if we combine this with Koolhaas et al., so there's a research group that have produced a lovely series of papers. They're really nice papers between about 2008 up to current day. So in 2016, the paper Koolhaas et al. Described aggression as a coping style. So if we take reactive aggression and think about it in terms of a coping style, Koolhaas's coping style, then we start to really get the nuts and bolts of how to investigate the neurobiology of canine aggression. So I absolutely think that the wand is not broken. I do accept that you're not supposed to throw sticks for your dogs, but this is a magic wand, so it can't possibly get stuck in Dennis's throat. Dennis is my little Chihuahua Yorkie who's fast asleep next to me while I'm lecturing. So, in terms of thinking about what is canine aggression, then I think it is quite helpful to think in terms of reactive aggression. I'm not saying that proactive aggression doesn't exist in dogs, and certainly I can remember one case I can certainly remember one case that I have encountered, as in personally encountered, being lunged at by, of a dog that was showing what I believe was proactive aggression. So neurobiologically, that was displayed as proactive aggression. But the vast majority of cases that I've encountered, I would consider to be reactive aggression. And it would be really interesting actually to talk to you guys about what percentage of your cases you think you see that are reactive compared to proactive. But I think certainly there are many, vastly more reactive aggressive cases in canine aggression than there are proactive. Now, if we look at Koolhaas's description of aggression as a coping style, then they would say that that includes behavioural flexibility, impulse control, emotional reactivity, harm avoidance, and reward processing, and that abnormalities or changes in any of those processes can lead to aggression. I would add to that motor reactivity. Koolhaas et al. Don't talk about motor reactivity, but motor reactivity is very much involved in the expression of aggressive behaviour. So motor reactivity would be the motor output, if you like, and the magnitude and speed with which that motor output is exhibited, associated with aggression, or not. Motor reactivity doesn't have to be associated with aggression. So I think this is an interesting point when we're thinking about canine aggression, because the bark and lunge are considered to be symptoms of canine aggression. But actually, when we look at some of those cases, I believe, are motor reactivity and actually don't have aggressive neurobiology underpinning them. So I have a rescue Rottweiler, Nancy, who appears on the Barking Brains page from time to time. And she's a very interesting case. And she had, when I first got her, she had reactivity in terms of displaying aggressive behaviour her case was quite complex. But essentially, I broke it down, worked with her to work on various different aspects of behavioural flexibility, impulse control, emotional reactivity, supporting her with harm avoidance, and supporting her with processing sensory information in such a way that she didn't need to take steps to avoid harm, and reward processing. But what we're left with now is that her aggressive behaviour is essentially gone. Certainly when I'm handling her, she doesn't display aggressive behaviour. And that's not because I've trained that out of her. That's simply because I've worked on things like emotional reactivity and supporting her behavioural flexibility so that she's in a better place to make better choices that are more appropriate and proportional for the situation. But the one thing that we're left with is motor reactivity. So if a bicycle goes past her very quickly while we're out and about, sometimes she lunges at the bicycle, and that lunge isn't associated with an emotional driver and isn't associated with aggressive behaviour. It's just simply a reflex, a motor reactivity reflex. And these types of reflexes are what we term tics. So they're abnormalities of motor processing as opposed to sensory and emotional processing or cognitive processing. This is just motor processing, so muscle processing, basically, the processing of the neurobiology of the muscles. So we get this motor reactivity that isn't underpinned by the neurobiology of aggression or emotional display. And this is what's known in people as tics. And tics can be quite violent. So if you're sat next to me and I punch you in the face, you're probably going to assume that I'm aggressive, that I've taken offence to something you've just said and I've aggressively responded to it. And that would be a fair enough assumption. But actually, if I suffered with severe tics, that punching you in the face could simply be an uncontrolled action. So an action that I don't have top-down cognitive control over. But from your point of view, what's really important here is that the experience for you is exactly the same. So you will view that as an aggressive behaviour, regardless of whether it is or it isn't. And that will be a natural reaction, even though that could be motor reactivity and not aggression. And I do think that some of the cases that we see with canine aggression are abnormalities in motor reactivity rather than abnormalities in some of these other areas. Of course, nothing is simple, so they're often complex. And as you start to work with, improving behavioural flexibility and reducing emotional reactivity and the various other activities that we will do with the dogs that will help with those things, then we can slim it down to some of the motor processing and start to see that motor reactivity is a component there. And motor reactivity is difficult to deal with in that it needs a different approach to some of the cognitive abnormalities. Now, the neurobiology of these cognitive processes and of motor reactivity is very well conserved across species. So this is where we really start to be able to delve into the neurobiology of canine aggression, because we can now draw upon the literature in humans who can talk, so can actually explain to us whether what punching us in the face was aggressive or was not aggressive. and animal species, so other animal species, because this neurobiology is so very well conserved. And obviously, we use other animal species for animal experimentation, so there's a vast amount of neuroscience knowledge that we gain from those. And I do understand that at this point, talking about animal experimentation or the fact that I'm going to draw upon some of the results that come from animal experimentation may be upsetting for some of you, and this is a safe space for this. I'm confronted by that every day of my career, and it is upsetting, but I do feel very, very strongly that society as a whole has decided that we will use animals to advance medical knowledge and fundamental science knowledge, and so it's incredibly important that we honour those animals by learning from those data. So yeah, I do feel very strongly that it's important that we look at the data produced from animal experiments and human experiments and merge them together to learn as much as we can, so that those animals were not used in vain. So let's have a look at some of the anatomy that is going to be important when we're thinking about aggression. So this three-dimensional model was created by Stephen Rose from the Evolving Brain Lab. And what he did is he took MRI data from a canine brain, inputted it into a computer program, and he's coloured it in various different colours, so that essentially what we have here is a canine brain dissection without actually having to dissect a canine brain. And what you can see here when the cortex has been peeled away is the subcortical areas. And these three, so the purple, red and green that we see spiralling around here is a cluster area around the striatum. And these blue areas are the amygdala, which are sitting at the bottom of the hippocampus in cream curled round. And those are subcortical areas that lie deep within the brain, that's covered by the cortex, which is this dark green layer that you can see coming over the surface of the brain. So the cortex there is the grey matter. That dark green is the grey matter of the brain. Okay, so if we now have a look at a midline cross-section of a brain, this is actually a rat's brain, not a dog's brain, but this brain is in the same orientation as Stephen's brain, or not Stephen's brain, but the brain that Stephen created with his three-dimensional modelling of a dog. So this rat brain's in the same orientation, so the front of the brain is to the left-hand side of the screen and the back of the brain is to the right-hand side of the screen. So the back of the brain is where it says autonomic and somatomotor nuclei. And where the areas, sorry, I'll just rewind a little bit. This cross-section of the rat brain shows all of the areas that are involved in aggression. So the processing of aggression behaviour and all of the actions that all of the processes that lead up to the actions involved in aggression. I'm actually only going to focus on two specific areas here today. So the prefrontal cortex at the top and the amygdala at the bottom. And those two are very structurally connected, as demonstrated by this red line connecting them both. So there are a lot of neurons that run directly between these two areas and also indirectly between these two areas. But to explain how they function together and how important that connection is together, I'm also going to talk about a third area, which isn't specifically shown on the diagram of the rat brain, but it's in roughly the area that I've circled here, which is the striatum. And the striatum sits between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala and acts to modulate the signals and the functionality between those two areas. So let's have a look at the limbic prefrontal cortex first. So the prefrontal cortex is the front part of the cortex. The cortex is the dark green layer that covers the brain, and the prefrontal cortex is the front part of that, so the part that's furthest over to the left-hand side. The limbic prefrontal cortex is a small part of that, and actually today we're only going to talk about two small parts of the limbic prefrontal cortex, but we'll call it limbic prefrontal cortex for simplicity. You can see why the neuroscience literature is so vast, but what I'm trying to do is pick out some important kind of global concepts of the neurobiology of aggression. Now, if we look at the role of the limbic prefrontal cortex in aggression, in aggressive individuals, the limbic prefrontal cortex has a decreased size, so it's smaller in terms of volume, and also has a decreased baseline activity. Now, the prefrontal cortex is the decision-making part of the brain, so think about it as the thinking part of the brain, if you like. So very, very involved in top-down control of other areas of the brain and deciding what actions are going to come from the incoming information that the brain is processing. So if we have a decrease in size and a decrease in baseline activity, you can see that's going to impact on the prefrontal cortex's ability to be able to control aggressive behavior. But that's not actually the whole story there, because even though the baseline activity is decreased in aggressive individuals, when those aggressive individuals are provoked, the activity in the prefrontal cortex increases far more. So you get a huge increase in activity. So actually the overall story here is really that in aggressive individuals, you get unstable activity within the prefrontal cortex. Now, if we have a look at the amygdala is an area that's very much involved in sensory integration, emotional processing, reward value processing, etc. And in the amygdala, what we see is that in aggressive individuals, the size of the amygdala is decreased and the activity overall is increased. But actually, that's not the whole story, because the activity in some areas of the amygdala is decreased and some areas is increased, but it's the global activity that's increased. What we really see again is unstable activity within the amygdala, and these different parts of the amygdala showing instability in terms of the activity. Now, if we come to the striatum, so that's the brain area that we said was modulating the communication between the limbic prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, we again see a global increase in activity, so similar to the amygdala. But again, that's not the whole story, because actually within the striatum, there are areas that have very much a decreased activity and robustly show decreased activity across many species. Some areas show an increase, and overall there's an increase. But again, what we see is this unstable activity. So we've got three areas here. We've got the limbic prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. Both of those areas are very well connected structurally and very well connected functionally. So they're working together within the brain. And we see that the activity in both of those brain areas becomes unstable in aggression cases. And the striatum is working to modulate or control the communication between those two brain areas. And we also see unstable activity in that brain area in aggression cases. So really what we're describing here is that we see altered coupling, and coupling is the teamwork between two brain areas. So altered coupling between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, so that they can't act in teamwork, they can't work together to produce an appropriate behavioural output. And then we also see this altered modulation or ability to modulate by the striatum. So again, we're losing this ability to ensure that the behavioural output is appropriate, of an appropriate magnitude, and is an appropriate action in the circumstances. Now, this image is taken from the Canine Brain Project, which is a fantastic website if you're interested in brain anatomy. Mohammed Spoktor runs an outreach project for high school kids or high school young people to train them in neurobiology, neuroanatomy of the canine brain. And this is one of the images that they produced looking at DTI data. So DTI data, diffusion tensor imaging data, is collected in an MRI scanner. So this was a post-mortem brain that was donated to the Canine Brain Project from an owner. And the brain was imaged using DTI imaging, which basically means that the brain's put on the MRI scanner table and the table vibrates whilst the images are being taken. It vibrates a lot. So it vibrates so that if you're 3 floors up, you can feel the vibration if you're in the same building when DTI is being taken. So it vibrates the brain, and what that does is it moves water molecules within the brain, and the water molecules can only move along the same lines as the neurons, because obviously they can't jump across neurons. So as they're vibrating, they can only move along the neurons. And so when you track that with the imaging, you actually then can essentially trace the neurons within the brain. And this is the way that we've been able to study structural connections between brain areas and see which brain areas are tightly structured together and which brain areas are less tightly structured together, and also see how that structure changes over time at different stages of development, and also subsequent to various interventions. So let's have a look at our three brain areas again. So prefrontal cortex, amygdala, and striatum. And what we see here is that because of these very strong connections, there's communication between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex that are involved in essentially perception, so perceiving the sensory information that are coming in. So the amygdala is receiving all of the sensory information, so that's visual information, auditory, tactile, taste, olfaction, etc. All of that information is coming in, being integrated in the amygdala, associated with other brain areas as well, but the amygdala is a very important brain area for that sensory integration. And then shuttling that information to the frontal cortex, so processing it and then sending that information to the frontal cortex. So that's how we perceive the world around us. And then the prefrontal cortex, which is very much essential for behavioural flexibility, for emotional reactivity, and also for harm avoidance, is processing all of the information that it's receiving from the amygdala and from other brain areas, and then deciding what the action should be that comes from that. Now, the striatum is modulating that perception action cycle. It's not really a cycle because it's not linear, so it doesn't just go round in that direction, but goes backwards and forwards as it's constantly updating. The striatum's really important for processes like impulse control and motor reactivity, and so really important for modulating that signal to make sure that the end result is a behaviour that is appropriate and proportional. And that's very much the theme of when we see aggression being displayed in dogs, is often that it's not appropriate because the situation doesn't actually require that the dog expresses aggression at that particular point, or that it's disproportional. Now, obviously, I'm saying the situation doesn't require that the dog expresses aggressive behaviour. The dog thinks it does. So in the dog's reality, yes, it's absolutely appropriate and proportional. But very much from the owner's point of view, or from our point of view, it's not necessarily appropriate and proportional. And that's what we really have to work with, is how do we work with the dog so that we can get a more appropriate and proportional response. Now, I mentioned that this loop, if you like, perception action loop, is not linear and not unitary. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that the actions produced by the limbic prefrontal cortex can actually influence the way that the amygdala perceives and integrates sensory information. And that's going on before the behavioural output. So we used to think in terms of so if we think of ABC, so antecedent, behaviour and consequence, we used to think of ABC in terms of a linear process. So you get something before the behaviour, then you get the behaviour, and then you get the consequence after the behaviour. But around the 1950s, we started to realise that actually that was too simplistic a model to explain the complexity of behaviour. And so we looked at exploring other learning theories, such as predictive models. So not just looking at post-diction, which is reinforcement learning. So at the event after the reward afterwards then informs the learning, so that's postdictive. We looked at predictive learning, so looking at the brain as a predictive model. So essentially what I mean by that is that through neuroscience studies looking at neuron activation and brain area activation, we can see that learning often is a huge component of learning involves prediction rather than postdiction. So the brain makes a prediction about what is likely to happen, and then it judges the outcome based on its prediction and updates its model. So it's not linear. This neurobiology is not linear. It's not as simple as antecedent behavior consequence, and it's not unitary. So there are several processes going on at once. So I'm not saying, for instance, that operant conditioning isn't a perfectly valid learning theory and that it isn't underpinned by neurobiology. It is, but it's not sufficient to explain animal learning. So it's only one component of the way animals learn. And actually, I think probably particularly for aggression cases, it often isn't the primary way that the brain learns. It's much more based on a predictive model. Okay, so by now I hope that you can list 3 important brain regions for aggression. I'll just leave you a couple of seconds to think about that. Prefrontal cortex, amygdala and striatum. And as I said, they're not the only brain areas involved in the expression of aggressive behaviour or the genetics of aggression when we're looking at abnormalities of brain areas that might lead to aggressive behaviour. But those 3 areas are key, and I think they're the main 3 areas that we think about when we're thinking about how the brain processes aggression, or how the brain processes sensory information and leads to an aggressive output. Okay, so let's have a look at a little bit more detail in terms of kind of microscopic anatomy rather than the whole brain anatomy. So let's have a think about neurotransmitters and how they might influence aggressive behaviour. The diagram that I'm showing you here is in order to show you a synapse. So this is 2 neurons. The first neuron has a cell body at the top of the slide, and the red dot in the middle is the nucleus within the cell body. And the axon of that neuron is covered in a blue myelin sheath. So you can see 3 sections of myelin sheath vertically coming down to the cell body of the second neuron, which is lying horizontally along the bottom of the slide. And that section, the circle, the chemical synapse that's blown up, is basically blowing up or increasing in size the connection between neuron 1 and neuron 2. So that chemical synapse there is how those 2 neurons communicate with each other. So if the first neuron is firing, then that firing is communicated to the second neuron across that synapse using chemicals called neurotransmitters. So the first neurotransmitter that I want to talk about is dopamine, and dopamine is involved in lots of different processes. So it's heavily involved and probably predominantly involved in motor processing, so neuromuscular activity. It's involved in decision making and also motivation, cognitive processing, and then obviously reward, which is what a lot of people know dopamine for, but that's only one of its functions. It has all of these other functions and many, many more also. So it's certainly a very important neurotransmitter. Now, aggressive hamsters, so this is strains of hamsters that are aggressive, have been shown to prefer an immediate small reward versus a large delayed reward. So that's showing that within aggressive animals we have this skewing of reward value. And that's related to dopamine. And we know that because if we look at experiments conducted predominantly in rats, but also in some other species, we see that aggressive animals have an increase in dopamine receptor density and also an increase in dopamine receptor binding within the striatum. And this is key because we said that striatum was one of our 3 key areas involved in aggression neurobiology. So we also see that humans have an increased dopamine releasing capacity in the striatum. Now, these data tell us different things. So some of these data tell us about the genetic changes that occur associated with aggression. So some of the things that will be different in those hamsters or rats that are bred to be aggressive versus those that are bred to be tame, for instance. But they also tell us about how these factors change in the development of aggression. So particularly in human studies, we can see that how the increase in dopamine releasing capacity can happen during a person's development and not just because of the genetic makeup. But again, locating in the striatum. So remember, if we look back at our perception action modulation diagram, the striatum is heavily involved in modulating that signal between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So these changes in dopamine receptor density, receptor binding, and in releasing capacity are actually altering the ability of the striatum to modulate. So altered modulation. Now, early life experience and developmental life stage can also alter modulation. I don't have time to talk about those here today, but it's important to remember that. Now, the second neurotransmitter I want to talk about is serotonin, and serotonin is important for mood, for cognitive processing, for sleep, for appetite, and also for modulation. So serotonin actually modulates dopamine processing and dopamine activity, or the activity of dopaminergic neurons, and also reactivity. So everything that applies to serotonin also applies to dopamine, because serotonin is modulating dopamine activity, or the activity of dopamine neurons. Now, predominantly, we see a decrease in serotonin in aggressive animals, and that's been shown right the way across all of the species, so invertebrates, rodents, primates, fish, birds, reptiles, humans. But it's not absolute, and certainly it's not the same for non-aggressive encounters or for other developmental stages. So there are some instances where serotonin will increase associated with aggression. So that's really important, and that's particularly if in non-aggressive individuals, when they're expressing aggression, you'll often see an increase in serotonin. And there are other examples as well, but predominantly we see a decrease in serotonin. So the most common change in serotonin in aggression cases is a decrease. Now, if we go back to looking at our perception action modulation diagram, a serotonin decrease alters coupling between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala for threatening stimuli. So we're going to see this altered coupling between, or teamwork between, the limbic prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So remember that dopamine is very much altering the modulation that's provided by the striatum, and decreased serotonin is altering the coupling, or the teamwork, between the limbic prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So we've got 2 different neurotransmitters, and we've got 2 different impacts of those neurotransmitters on aggressive behaviour. Now, hormones and early life experience also alter prefrontal cortex amygdala coupling, and I don't have time to talk about those today, but again, really important to remember that those are important factors. So by now, I hope you can describe 2 ways that brain function is disturbed in aggressive animals. So 1, altered coupling or teamwork between different brain areas, and 2, altered modulation or stability or appropriateness of the behaviour. So altering the modulation of the output from the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. If you haven't been put off the neurobiology by now, I'm going to leave it now and move on to practical applications. But if you're particularly interested, Rosalind Seaver, 2015, is a nice review. 2 excellent neuroscientists from the Icahn School of Medicine, where I was assistant professor. And a lot of what I've talked about here today is taken from that paper. So if you're not put off and you want to take a deep dive into the literature, then that's quite a nice paper for that. So let's move on to application, because that is, after all, what's most important. It's interesting to understand the neurobiology, but what's mostly interesting is to be able to apply the neurobiology or think about how that might apply to the aggression cases. Now, isn't it all determined by genetics and early life experience? Well, that's pretty much what a lot of the experiments have shown us, right? And certainly what I've alluded to throughout the talk. But no, it's not. It's not already predetermined. And actually, the old idea that genetics were set and predetermined has been superseded by the huge explosion in epigenetic research, showing that experience can impact on the expression of our genetic makeup and vice versa. So still really important to remember that we can influence aggression cases, even though we might not be able to directly change the genetics, and we certainly can't change the early life experience. So one of the ways that we can influence brain pathways is through sleep, through good quality sleep. And it's been shown in a number of different studies, it's a robust effect across many decades in many different species, that disturbed sleep decreases the coupling or the teamwork between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. Now, if we remember our diagram here, perception, action, modulation, disturbed sleep is going to interfere with this communication between the 2 key brain areas that are responsible for receiving all of the sensory information and then deciding what to do with it. So this uncoupling or decreasing coupling leads to unstable activity, and that then leads to emotional instability. And if you remember right at the beginning of this talk, we talked about that being the functional the functional similarity between the different brain areas in aggression cases was this unstable activity. And disturbed sleep directly feeds into that because of the uncoupling between the PFC and the amygdala. So disturbed sleep is associated with increased aggression, and it's slightly different to lack of sleep. There's a difference between disturbed sleep and lack of sleep. So when we're thinking about how this might apply to dogs, it's really important not just to think about the total amount of time that the dog spends sleeping, but think about how disturbed its sleep may be. Now, there might be obvious causes of disturbed sleep. So it might be a household that's very busy with a young baby, with an adult that works nights, for instance. But there may also be underlying factors that lead to disturbed sleep that are not so obvious, such as pain, for instance. Now, pain decreases melatonin, so that in and of itself leads to disturbed sleep. Pain can obviously disturb sleep because you wake up because you're painful, or you shift in the night and that's painful, and then therefore you wake up. But pain decreases melatonin, so you across all species, I was going to say you, but you're a human, but whether it's you or it's a dog, when we're thinking about a dog aggression case, if the animal has an underlying pain condition, it will have a lower amount of melatonin, so its production of melatonin will be decreased, and so therefore it will have disturbed sleep. Sorry, not undisturbed sleep. It will have disturbed sleep. And even if it makes that up in terms of the total duration of sleep, that's still a factor that will influence, that will decrease the coupling between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. Now, pain is also associated with decreased tryptophan and serotonin. Tryptophan is just a dietary precursor to serotonin. So we make serotonin by converting tryptophan, which we can get through diet. And pain is associated with decreased tryptophan and decreased serotonin. And remember that we said that serotonin was one of the neurotransmitters that was particularly important in aggression cases. Pain's also associated with an increase in inflammatory cytokines, and inflammatory cytokines have a whole range of effects on behaviour. So certainly they can lead to disturbed sleep in and of themselves, but they also lead to uncoupling of the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, and also interfere with modulation via the striatum. So there are a whole range of inflammatory cytokines, and they have lots of different effects on behaviour. So pain is a really, really important factor in all behaviour cases, but again, especially for cases where disturbed sleep is particularly an issue, and for aggression cases. So disturbed sleep and low serotonin are going to decrease the coupling between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, and the low serotonin and the inflammatory cytokines are going to lead to altered modulation by the striatum. Now, we mentioned dietary tryptophan before, and it's interesting because there was a study this year by DiNapoli showing that tryptophan supplementation decreases aggression in dogs. Now, that's via promoting coupling between brain areas and promoting modulation of brain activity, because that's because the tryptophan supplementation is increasing serotonin. So that's leading to the promotion of coupling and the promotion of modulation, both directly through serotonin and indirectly because serotonin modulates dopaminergic neurons. The study itself is a small sample size, so in and of itself, I would call it a pilot study, but it's a really interesting pilot study because actually this is a robust effect that's been shown in other species, not in all cases of aggression, so I'm not suggesting that tryptophan is the answer to aggression cases, but it's certainly been shown that tryptophan deficiency can underlie some cases of aggression. And if you think about some of the pain cases, for instance, where tryptophan is decreased, you can imagine that supplementing tryptophan in the diet may well have a positive impact. So it's too early to say that we should be using this as a first-line treatment, for instance, but it's really, really interesting that DiNapoli found this. DiNapoli et al. And colleagues. Now, there's lots of talk about the gut microbiome and its connection with behaviour. And last year, Kirchhoff et al. Showed that gut microbiome was a different composition in aggressive versus non-aggressive dogs. So this study looked at fighting pit bulls. So basically, they looked at pit bulls that were seized from a fighting ring. They separated them into two groups, those that showed aggressive behaviour and those that did not show aggressive behaviour. And one of the things that they looked at was sample of the gut microbiome and showed that it was a different composition. Now, again, these data are supported by data in other species, particularly humans, showing this effect. So it's really interesting. It's probably too early. Well, it is too early to know whether this is cause or effect. So were those pit bulls born with a different gut microbiome or a different likelihood to develop a different gut microbiome, or was it their experience of aggression that changed their gut microbiome? And we don't really know that yet. So overall, it's too early to say what dietary changes we should be making for aggressive dogs, but it's certainly the case that there's a lot of data out there increasingly showing this connection between diet and aggression, between the gut microbiome and aggression. So it's really interesting, and I think it's an area that we need to keep an eye on and watch with interest. So I hope by now you'll be able to identify 3 ways to influence brain pathway in aggression cases. So sleep, pain and diet, and by that I mean ensuring undisturbed sleep, so not just quantity of sleep, but undisturbed sleep. And that might be as simple as making sure that the dog has somewhere undisturbed to go and rest. So, a crate covered with a blanket in a room, or periods of the day where it's undisturbed. And particularly in busy households, I think this can be a real problem. And certainly from my work with the Rottweiler Welfare Association, a lot of the dogs that were handed in came from very, very busy households, lots of young children, lots of coming and going. And I think it's not surprising, therefore, that those dogs were exhibiting, in some cases, aggressive responses because they really didn't have a chance of getting undisturbed sleep. Their sleep was very, very disturbed and intermittent. They could only nap, basically. Pain, it's really important to get a proper pain assessment of any behaviour case, but particularly any aggression case, or not even particularly, any behaviour case, get a good pain assessment. And by good pain assessment, I mean a thorough physical exam, neuromuscular exam and neurological exam, looking at all three of those components with a view to identifying inflammatory pain, chronic pain and neuropathic pain. So that's what I mean about a full pain assessment, as opposed to just a physical exam to see whether there are any obvious signs of lameness or responses to physical examination. And then looking at whether or not pain medication or modification of lifestyle is needed in order to reduce pain as an influencing factor. And then, as we said, diet is the third one. And other than keeping an eye on tryptophan supplementation for some aggression cases, we're really not yet in a position to understand exactly how to create, how to modify the diet specifically for aggression cases. But we certainly know that it's extremely important, and it's been seen as being a factor. So gut microbiome is an area to keep an eye on for sure. Now, one last thing I'd just like to mention before I disappear is sensory integration. So that wasn't included in the Koolhaas cognitive domains, if you like, when looking at aggression as a coping strategy. But actually, sensory integration is a really important area to think about, because that's all of the processing of the sensory information as it comes into the brain. And we said that the amygdala was heavily involved in that processing, but there are other brain areas that are heavily involved in that processing as well. And what's really important to recognise is that when things go wrong with sensory integration and sensory processing, it's important to be able to give the dogs processing time and activities that promote processing time, such as scent work, to be able to get that sensory integration back into balance. So it's not just about looking at the behavioural output when you're looking at aggression cases. It's really about starting right at the beginning and looking at how that sensory information is perceived and processed. And we know that the various factors I've talked about, so sleep, pain and diet, all influence sensory integration and processing. And what I mean by that is that how you perceive the world around you, so what you see, what you smell, what you hear, is heavily influenced by those other factors. So the sensory processing in some of these cases may well be altered, and we need to be able to get that back on track and get that back in balance. And we do that by giving the brain time to process that sensory information. And if we think back to the diagram of the perception action modulation between the three brain areas of interest in aggression cases, what's really important is that the dog has enough time to be able to integrate all of that sensory information before the prefrontal cortex has to make a decision. if the prefrontal cortex has to make a decision very quickly, then the brain won't have enough time to process all of that sensory information in a healthy way. And so by giving the brain a longer period of time to do that processing, we can improve the chances that the decision made will be appropriate and proportional. So what do I mean by that? Well, that's why it's important to make sure that we give our animals distance from stressors, from triggers. So if we're working with a dog that's dog aggressive in the park, it's really important that we give physical distance between the dog that we're working with and other dogs. And we work with the dog at that distance until we've got the dog's sensory integration and processing back in balance. Now, we may not know whether it's back in balance or not, but we're judging that by behavioural output. So we're judging that indirectly by behavioural output. And we're then making a prediction about whether it's safe to move closer in terms of distance to then work with the dog at a shorter distance. If we've made a mistake, we move back and we again increase the time that the brain has to make those, to process that sensory information before making a decision about what behavioural output it needs to exhibit. So sensory integration is a really, really key process, and often we don't give the dogs enough time for that sensory integration and processing to take place. And so it's not surprising that the decision made is either disproportional or inappropriate, because the brain just simply hasn't had enough time to do that processing. And I mentioned scent work there because that's my preferred way of working with dogs, regardless of what the behavioural issue is, but particularly if I'm working with a dog that has a tendency to express aggressive behaviour, whether that's barking, lunging, etc. Scent work olfaction is amazing. Olfaction is so interesting. I'm doing a couple of webinars on the neurobiology of olfaction at the beginning of 2021. It's my favourite subject, and there I'll very much be talking about this interaction between scent work and sensory integration. But olfaction is really, really interesting because it's so heavily connected with emotional processing, and it's also heavily connected with slowing down that sensory integration and that sensory processing, and reducing the decision making, the focus on decision making, because scent work is quite different to all of the other activities that we do with our dogs, or most of the other activities, sports activities that we do with our dogs, in that scent work is driven by the dog, and the dog doesn't have to pay attention to the handler in order to be good at scent work. In most circumstances, I mean, there are times when it pays to pay attention to the handler, but largely that activity is driven by the dog. If you compare that to agility, for instance, where in order to be good at agility, you have to be able to follow the instructions that are given to you by your owner. You can't, I mean, you can be brilliant at running around and jumping over jumps and going through tunnels, but unless you do them in the correct order, you're not going to win. So to be good at that activity, you have to be heavily dependent on the owner and paying attention to the owner. Whereas in scent work, that's not the case. And certainly if you look at tracking, for instance, the owner is, or the handler is pretty inconsequential. Sorry if that offends any of you who do tracking, but actually that's what I adore about tracking, because I absolutely love the fact that I take a back seat and I can watch my dog doing what it loves to do. So scent work and any activities that involve olfaction and scent work are really, really important for being able to get that balance of sensory integration and sensory processing. And any of you who are interested in activities that are kind of based around this, look at the ACE page. So ACE Connections on Facebook, which is Sarah Fisher's page, looking at free work and how you can set up activities that promote, the free work isn't specifically to promote scent work, but you'll see when you go on the page how free work is set up, that it's very scent dependent. So it's looking at encouraging olfaction and encouraging interaction of the dog with the environment around it using its nose. Now, all of that is important because when we're working with dogs, what we're really working with is we are influencing experience-dependent plasticity. So what we're wanting to do is change the experience of the dog so that we can influence the plasticity that occurs within the brain, so that when we're not working with the dog anymore, that plastic change to structure and function of the brain means that the behavioural output will change longer term. So put in plain English, we work with the dog to change the structure and function of its brain so that it no longer responds aggressively in those situations where it used to respond aggressively, or the magnitude of the aggressive response is very much reduced to a level that the owner or handler can manage. So that's our aim, is to work on experience-dependent plasticity. That's our job when we're working with the dog. And in order to set ourselves up with the best ability to do that, it's really important to stop and think about sensory integration and processing balance through things like extending processing time and activities that involve scent work. So that just leaves me to thank a few people who have helped me along the way. So Pete Jelly, who's responsible for the graphics, for some of the graphics in the presentation. Hannah Capon from Canine Arthritis Management. Her and I spend a lot of time talking about the link between pain and behaviour because it's of great interest to both of us. Bobby Banbury from Behaviour Vets, who is a dog training and behaviour consultant, who's really helped me with Barking Brains and is very supportive. And then all you Barking Brainers, I've been very silent in 2020 because the global pandemic hit and I ended up working crazy hours in my day job. But I'm going to get back into Barking Brains and start posting soon. So thank you very much for listening. And the only other thing I wanted to mention was that if you found this interesting and you've decided that you want to hear more about neurobiology, then I'm teaming up with Behaviour Vets for our first Barking Brains event, which is a deep dive into the neurobiology of sensory integration. So we'll be looking at a case study. So Neville is a young golden retriever who lives in New York City, and he was experiencing disproportional fear responses to the outside world. And we're going to talk about how we're going to talk about the neurobiology of sensory integration and how we worked with Neville, or how Bobby and Elise Christensen, the vet behaviourist, worked with Neville in order to support his sensory integration and improve his sensory processing so that his behavioural output became more appropriate, and particularly to modify his emotional experience associated with sensory integration and experiencing the world through sensory integration. So thanks very much for listening. I really, really appreciate it. And it's a great pleasure and an honour to be here with you. So thank you.